On August 6, 1915, the German army released 150 tons of chlorine against a single Russian fortress. Most of the garrison was dead within minutes. The assault column advanced expecting silence. What came through that poisoned cloud, instead, bloodied, half-blind, lungs dissolving, sent 7,000 soldiers into full retreat. To understand how dead men charged an army, you need to understand the fortress that refused to fall. Osowiec Fortress did not survive by stone and steel alone. It was built atop a landscape that seemed to conspire against every attacker. The Biebrza River, swollen by summer rains, wrapped the stronghold in a ring of marshland and stagnant pools. In places, the ground itself turned to sucking mud, swallowing boots and artillery wheels. German engineers called it a natural moat, a barrier that defied their maps and their siege plans. Beyond the river, the fortress bristled with earthworks and a glacis of tightly packed sand. This was no ordinary slope. The sand, layered and tamped by Russian sappers, absorbed the shock of high-explosive shells. Even after hours of bombardment, the surface would slump, then settle, refusing to yield a breach. German artillery, 15 centimeters howitzers, and 21 centimeters mortars, pounded the defenses through the spring and early summer of 1915. Shells cratered the outer works but failed to collapse the main ramparts. Reports from the 11th Landwehr Division described the Russian parapets as impervious, the sandglasses as resistant to every known explosive. Desperation drove the Germans to new tactics. Engineers tunneled forward at night, digging saps, narrow trenches meant to carry troops, and charges to the base of the fortress wall. But the water table had risen, each sap filled with brackish water, and had to be shored up with timber and sandbags, a slow, grueling process. On July 10th, a 500-kilogram mine was detonated beneath the western redoubt. The explosion collapsed the tunnel, killing German pioneers and leaving the Russian defenses mostly intact. The fortress had turned the earth itself into an ally. Artillery, mining, and stormtrooper raids all failed to open the way. The Germans, battered by weeks of frustration, began to look for something that could seep past earth and water, something that would not be stopped by sand or mud. Orders moved down the German line in the dark, clipped and final. The 11th Landwehr Division, nearly 7,000 strong, took their positions behind a barricade of cylinders, steel tanks filled with chlorine, 150 tons in all. Sonder pioneer detachments, trained for siege and sabotage, had spent days hauling these tanks through mud and bracken, assembling them along the forward saps. The men worked by lamplight, faces drawn and silent as engineers connected hoses and checked the seals. The plan was simple, its consequences anything but. At dawn, open the valves and let the gas do what artillery could not. The German command had chosen this weapon out of frustration and calculation. Reports from the 8th Corps described the Russian defenses as nearly immune to shell fire, the sand glacis swallowing every shell, the marshes turning every advance into a crawl. High command demanded a breakthrough. The only tool left was chemical, a weapon already tested at Ypres, now prepared on a scale the Eastern Front had not yet seen. Meteorologists had been summoned to the headquarters tent, their maps and wind charts spread across a battered table. They tracked the air currents over the Biebrza plain, searching for a window when the wind would hold steady, low, and eastward. On the night of August 5th, the forecast arrived, a breeze of 3 to 4 kilometers per hour, just enough to carry the chlorine over the Russian lines, not so strong as to blow it back. The order was given. At first light, the sappers would open the valves, and the fortress would drown in a green, acrid fog. There was no room for doubt or mercy. The German command believed the gas would force the Russians from their dugouts, choking and blinded, and finally break the siege. No one spoke of what the soldiers on either side would see or suffer. The plan was a calculation, tonnage, wind speed, and the hope that death would move faster than resistance. The green cloud rolled low, hugging the earth as it seeped into Russian trenches. Chlorine, heavier than air, pooled in the hollows, finding every breath, every open wound. Soldiers gasped and clawed at their faces as the gas met the damp lining of their mouths and throats. In seconds, the chemistry turned deadly. Chlorine mixed with water in the airways, forming hydrochloric and hypochlorous acids, corrosive agents that burned through mucous membranes and dissolved the surfactant that kept lungs intact. The first sensation was a burning in the nose and throat, then a violent, racking cough. Men doubled over, their eyes streaming, skin stinging as if scalded. Within half a minute, airways began to swell shut. Bronchospasm gripped the chest, making each breath a battle against invisible hands. Some tried to shout orders, but their voices vanished in a fit of choking. Blood began to fleck the foam on their lips. Russian medical records later counted hemoptysis, coughing up blood, in 37% of the exposed. For many, it got worse. Fluid flooded the alveoli, turning each inhale into a drowning. Pulmonary edema, the suffocation of the living, claimed 60 to 70% of those who inhaled the densest gas. Bandages, meant for bullet wounds, turned dark with blood and mucus. Some men clutched at their throats, eyes bulging, desperate for air. Others collapsed, their bodies racked by convulsions. The stench of chlorine, metallic and sharp, coated every surface. Skin blistered where sweat met acid. The ground was littered with men who seemed already dead, but a few, through some blend of shock and adrenaline, staggered upright, faces raw and streaked with red. In that moment, the line between the living and the dead blurred. The fortress had become a place where the body's limits were tested by chemistry, and horror was measured in the sound of men drowning on dry land. Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski's voice rasped through the ruins at 6:45. His order was simple: fix bayonets, advance. Around him, 60 men staggered to their feet, their faces wrapped in blood-soaked rags, uniforms stiff with dried mucus and chemical burns. Some coughed so hard they could barely stand. Others wiped at eyes swollen nearly shut. The air still stung, thick with the metallic taste of chlorine and the coppery tang of blood. But something primal took hold, the body's last surge against oblivion. Modern science calls it catecholamine release, a flood of adrenaline that can, for a few desperate minutes, mask agony and force shattered lungs to draw breath. In these men, it was the difference between collapse and movement. They advanced in a ragged line, bayonets glinting through the green haze, boots squelched in mud, slicked with vomit and blood. The barbed wire, once a death trap, had been softened by the gas and the night's rain. Men clawed through it, skin tearing, rags catching on iron. Behind the wire, the German formation, hundreds deep, froze at the sight. Accounts from the 11th Landwehr Division describe a wave of figures that seemed already dead, faces blackened, mouths frothing red. Some Germans fired, but their shots went high. Others dropped rifles and turned, panic spreading like infection. One German officer's diary recorded, "We thought we faced the damned, not the living." By 7:10, order had dissolved. German soldiers tripped over their own barricades, shouting for help, tossing aside packs and helmets. The Russian charge, more apparition than army, broke the front line. In the chaos, 12 Germans were taken prisoner. The rest vanished into the rear, leaving guns and wounded behind. For the survivors of Osowiec, the charge ended as quickly as it began. Many collapsed after the adrenaline faded, lungs filling with fluid. But for those few minutes, the dead had indeed charged the living, and the living had fled. By early September 1915, the fortress that had defied German guns and gas faced a different enemy, time. Orders arrived from Russian high command. Osowiec must not fall into enemy hands intact. The battered survivors, joined by engineering detachments, moved through the ruined corridors and shattered gun emplacements. They worked in silence, laying charges beneath the armored turrets and stuffing black powder into the magazines. Every step echoed with the memory of the dead and the dying. The engineers, some still coughing from the chlorine weeks before, set fuses and checked the wiring by lantern light. On the night of withdrawal, the last defenders slipped away across the marshes. Moments later, a series of dull, rolling explosions tore through the heart of Osowiec. The sky lit with burning debris as the fortress that had refused to die was finally silenced by its own defenders. What the Germans entered was a scorched husk. Walls blasted open, gun carriages twisted, the air thick with the smell of smoke and old blood. The stronghold's legacy was not a German victory, but a ruin left behind by men who would not surrender, not to the enemy, and not to fate. The horror at Osowiec did not end with the silence of the guns. In the months that followed, military planners and medical officers sifted through the aftermath, searching for lessons in the carnage. Dr. Eleanor Watson, a specialist in chemical warfare history, points to the fortress as a turning point, not just for tactics, but for the imagination of war. German reports, once clinical, became laced with warnings about the psychological impact of facing men who seemed to rise from the grave. Russian and German propaganda seized on the image, fueling rumors of the undead and stoking terror on both sides. Behind the myth, armies scrambled for answers. The first crude gas masks, cotton pads soaked in sodium thiosulfate, were rushed to the front. Archive records show these early prototypes failed more often than they worked, but their very existence signaled a new era. Survival now depended on chemistry as much as courage. The doctrine of gas warfare, born in the fog at Osowiec, would haunt every front line that followed. The image of blood-soaked, gas-burned men charging through the mist became a warning, a glimpse of how modern war could unmoor the mind, and how the line between fear and fact would blur in the trenches for years to come. Chemical weapons still haunt modern battlefields. Beneath every new advance, the terror at Osowiec lingers, a reminder that war pushes bodies and minds to the edge of the unimaginable. What began as desperation became legend. The line between the living and the dead blurs, and it never quite closes.